Hello, my friends, and welcome to GTA Interviews, a series where I interview other creatives on the YouTube platform about video games and the influences they have on people. And today I'm joined by Pat Holleman, the author of the Reverse Design series of books. And Pat, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. The first time I encountered your series of books was actually with just a random Reddit post that I made asking people for books about games so that I could become more educated on them. And yours were one of the first to be recommended to me. So if you could say hello and introduce yourself, give a bit of your background, and also talk about what inspired you to go ahead and write that book series.
Yeah, sure. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me. So back in 2008, I graduated from college at the peak of the recession. And I had a long time interest in game development, something I really wanted to do. But the problem that I had was I couldn't program. I'm a lousy artist, actually a little bit colorblind. And many of my attempts to become a programmer have failed. People who work with me know that it's a disaster when I try and do that. So they just keep me away from that end of things. But I graduated with the only skills I really had were I knew sort of how to write. I look back on my writing now and say, oh boy, that was amateurish. And I knew how to do research. And at the time, there was a lot of game writing about the humanistic side of video games. Like a lot of people were writing about BioShock and Ayn Rand and how all how the meaning is in the game or how it's conveyed. And they were starting to write about some older games and how like there's this phenomenon called ludonarrative dissonance, which I won't really go into now. But I wanted to do something different than everyone else was doing. That was my goal. I was like, well, I can't do what everyone else is doing. They have a head start. They're more likable. They have a big network, and I don't. I'm way behind. And so I tried to write about game design. Like, what are the practical decisions that make games fun? How are games made? What are the numbers and the nuts and bolts going on under the hood in a game? And start in 2010 writing seriously about games. I wrote some sort of mid-length articles, like 2,000 to 5,000 words, about level up systems, and I did one about Chrono Trigger. So that article on Chrono Trigger, actually, where I started doing things like counting the number of treasure chests that were in a certain segment of the game to explain why the pacing was the way it was. And then it sort of occurred to me, like, nobody else is doing this. I could be the one to go through the game and sort of just use like the Kaiser Soze method, where I'm just willing to do what other people are not. I'll go through, I'll count all of the words in the script, I'll count all of the treasure chests and all of the enemy encounters, I'll put everything in the game in a spreadsheet, and then I'll try and unify everything that I've learned about any given game under one thesis, and then write essentially a book-length essay about that. And so my first attempt was Final Fantasy VI, where I did analyze the script. Numerically, I counted every battle. I put formulas into spreadsheets that explained how every attack works and why this, how every formula and why the dynamics of the game are the way they are. And I unified that all under this single thesis that the game was meant to be played with any set of characters. And in order to make that happen, they had to change certain fundamental attributes of the RPG. They had to get rid of character classes, and they had to make everyone roughly equal. Light and heavy armor had to be made equal. The magic system had to be widely applicable. Anyway, there's a lot of things, and I don't need to go into all of them, but basically looking at all of that, I assembled everything into one thesis and then published it, and the response was pretty good. I did a Kickstarter where I said I was going to write 5 more books because I was doing stretch goals, and that was a bad decision. Don't repeat that. But I promised, and as I was getting every $500, I was like, oh yeah, $500, this will be enough. If I look back at it, I was probably making less than $1 per hour based on the Kickstarter because each book took about 1,000 hours to write. But over time, I was just like, I'm going to do this. I'm committed. That stubbornness ended up, resulting in a 6-book series, which is now actually out in paperback. Still not earning much more than $1 an hour, but it's led to me getting some other opportunities in game development, which has been nice.
Yeah, that's very cool. It's it's crazy how, I mean, it's somewhat taken for granted after anyone who's familiar with your work has seen it, how you can look at, the numbers in such a methodical way and sort of completely reverse engineered like the core concepts of the game and how the numbers themselves bear out like necessities for establishing those core concepts, those base level creative ideas, sort of you like just controlled the direction that the game had to be made in order to achieve them in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I deliberately picked games that I knew well, with one exception, which was Half-Life. That was that I let my backers vote during the Kickstarter, and they came to the consensus like somebody wanted this game, and a bunch of people wanted a bunch of different games, but the one game they could come to consensus on was Half-Life. So I said, all right, I'll write a book about it. And I learned probably the most about a game that I didn't know about Half-Life. I don't know that I learned the most overall, but I certainly discovered a lot of things about Half-Life that I had no idea about. I had played it, I think, once. And so that one was probably the most difficult to write, just because I started from essentially nothing. I knew nothing about the game, really. But every other game, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, Diablo 2, and Super Mario World, were all games that I had beaten probably 10 plus times each. So I had an idea going in what I was going to say. And it was really only in two of the books that my scope really expanded on me. The Super Mario World book, I was going to approach it from the same sort of broadly statistical way that I was going to for the first two books, which are on Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. And then once I got into it, I was like, oh no, I have to literally go through and analyze every level and put that on the page, or else this won't be complete. Because the whole of Super Mario World is not about mechanics. It's about level design. I mean, the mechanics of Mario are well known, well established. They don't change that much. It's level design that makes each game unique. So I had to go through and analyze all the levels, and in doing that, I learned so many things about video game design from Shigeru Miyamoto himself, essentially. And I'm going to also give credit to Takashi Tezuka, or Tezuka, I think is how it's pronounced, and because those two guys had essentially revolutionized the way that the games were designed twice. So I think there are three or four major epochal shifts in game design. One was in 1978 with Space Invaders. One was in 85 with Super Mario Bros. And then I would say the third one was in 1990 with Super Mario World, which really sort of informed the way level design would be done forever. So that one I learned a lot, like a great deal. That was sort of the goal for me, since I knew I wasn't going to be earning a lot of money. I wanted to learn as much as I could about game development, and I succeeded modestly, I would say.
Modest success is still success. I mean, if you were able to share your self-educational process with people, and like that's infinitely valuable. It's one of my goals with my channel is to try to learn things myself and share them with people as I experience them. So I suppose if we could get to the topic of the day, the first question of the interview series, which is, what is the most significant thing you have learned from a game? So I'm going to ask you first, what game are we going to be talking about?
We'll probably go into XenoGears, in terms of like life lessons. That game affected me more than any other. I want to have a little bit of preamble where I also go back to Super Mario World. I learned more about game design from Super Mario World than any other game. I wrote 5 other books. I probably learned as much about game design from Super Mario World as the other 5 combined. Just because the things in it are so universally applicable. So for game development, Super Mario World is a great one to study. But for life, it's a different game, which is a very flawed game, and one whose design I do not recommend following at all, but which has much more profound implications, which is the 1998 Squaresoft PlayStation 1 RPG, XenoGears.
Great. Well, XenoGears is a game that I hear talked about a lot, mainly just by people who say that, it was they either say it was a profoundly philosophical game, which piques up my interests in particular, or they tell me that the game was something more akin to a spiritual or religious experience. And that sort of, for a lot of people who are fans of philosophy, those two words tend not to let themselves overlap. You have to keep those categories as separate as possible, which I don't think is necessarily, important very much. An idea is an idea. So I guess, unless you want to pause and continue talking more about Super Mario World, what's the thing that, what's the most important lesson you learned, or the most significant thing you learned from playing XenoGears?
I think the biggest thing, and I did a video with Resident Arc about this topic, which is talking about that the story of XenoGears unifies three schools of thought. It looks at the ancient religion of Gnosticism, which is essentially a Platonic version of Christianity that developed in the late 2nd century. Kabbalah, which is it's a Jewish mystical tradition from the which started in I think the 1200s in Spain, and then Freudian psychology. So it looked at all of those three things and said, what are these three ideas have in common? What is the core message of each? What is a core message of each? Because I don't think there's a single core message, but especially with Freud, he's all over the place. Staying on topic was not his forte. But they all have in common the idea of that these are paths for someone to become whole, to become a unified, more complete person. So in Gnosticism, you become whole by attaining spiritual enlightenment. But knowledge is good and the material world is bad. And by accessing secret knowledge and understanding the world as it truly is and transcending your physicality, you can become a more whole person. The physical and the spiritual parts of you go into the proper relation, which is more spiritual than physical. In Kabbalah, there's a strain, since it's all commentary on Genesis, essentially, there's a strain where it's like that a man and a woman complete each other. And then only together are you a whole being, and that's right. Of course, that's straight out of Genesis. But the commentaries often emphasize that, even if they subject women's rights. It's one of those interesting dichotomies. But that's a deep topic we don't need to go into right now. And then in Freudian psychology, you need to balance you understand your subconscious desires and your conscious desires, your ego, your id, and your superego, and those things need to be in balance. And only by understanding those things, understanding every part of yourself, can you become like a whole, complete person. And this was then expanded greatly by Carl Jung, I'm going to pronounce it correctly, who was a disciple of Freud's for a long time, and I think is an extension of Freud's thinking, in as much as it was very unscientific. But the XenoGears looks at how all of the people in the story become a whole through various means. Some people by reincarnation, having relationships, and then sometimes in negative ways. The story of XenoGears, and it's impossible to spoil XenoGears, so don't worry. It's this plot you can't understand the plot until you've played it, so there's no spoiling it. But the story of XenoGears, the background story is essentially that there's a interstellar war machine that was blown up and was trying to become whole again. And that process takes place over 10,000 years and is very complicated, but that's sort of the background. And so this idea of both symbolically and literally becoming whole, and all of the religious and philosophical and psychological ideas that go into that, looking at the same problem through many different lenses, taught me a lot about intellectual life, and that that you can derive a great amount of meaning from traditions that you don't necessarily believe in. I'm not a Gnostic nor a Jewish person. I don't really believe in Freudian psychology as a holistic thing, nor Jung. But I think that all of those schools of thought have had certain insights which shed light on the human condition in a way, and where they overlap says something really profound, because the people in different places, thousands of years apart, literally thousands of years apart, in different material conditions, in different statuses in society, have all said, wholeness, we need a path to becoming whole. We're all broken from the start, and we need to become whole. So I thought that was great, and it really introduced me to a lot of intellectual life that I thought beforehand was more pretentious and didn't really deserve as much study and was sort of useless. But I think XenoGears convinced me that studying will lead you to key insights in life. It's not just so you can impress other smart people, around the cafe table.
Though it can be very important to impress those people at the cafe, because, at some point you need to, find a life partner, if you want, that is.
You do need a lot of live people to go through life with, that's for sure. You're going to need support. And actually, that's another message of XenoGears, is that you're going to need a Nakama. It's not as heavy as, like, let's instantly form a Nakama, as other Japanese media are. Like, let's have 7 people of these specific archetypes are all going to come together because they're desperate and don't know how to live apart, which is a trope I do not like at all in anime and Japanese media generally. But XenoGears is not like that. XenoGears is very much a fractious group who only slowly come together and only for good reason.
True. Japan's collectivist culture does really encourage that sort of narrative to be the most commonplace among the idea of socializing with people. But I want to try to harp on this idea of sort of the interdisciplinary aspect of XenoGears a little bit more, because what that really speaks to me is sort of how I view philosophy, the practice as a whole, not as a distinct practice, but as one in which the many different points of view are supposed to come together and debate and discuss and share perspectives. Anyone who watches my channel has probably heard me say that my definition for the word philosophy is wisdom through the loving dialogue between friends, by combining both the historical practice of philosophy with the etymology of the 2 parts of the word. Now, so with this theme of becoming whole, and I guess we're starting to get into the second question of the interview, which is how did the game go about teaching that theme and the interdisciplinary way in which it taught the theme? What sort of things did the game do? What sort of things did the player have to do while playing the game that emphasized that theme of becoming whole from different perspectives?
Sure. I think one of the most impressive things that XenoGears did was in its symbolic communication, in that, like, it's, like, someone can tell you it's important to become whole, but it makes, like, it's something penetrates your soul more when you're looking at someone who actually is becoming whole in the story and over a course of a long period of time, right? The slowly developing relationship between the 2 leads in XenoGears, Faye and Ellie, which really is played out in a really sort of paced way, a slow-paced way, but the way they balance each other out and need each other is really, I don't know, it's probably one of the more mature relationships I've seen in any game, at least up to that point. I don't know about since. I don't play as many games as I used to, as much as I'd like to. And I don't want to speak bad about, Ubisoft or BioWare and I know they're pushing the boundaries these days. I'm not caught up on that. But at the time, that was a relationship that was much more mature than, say, your typical JRPG romance, which was, also a product of, Final Fantasy VI only has like 19,000 words in it. XenoGears has like, depending on how you count, it has between 116,000 and 140,000. Again, depending on what you choose to include in the script. And so they had time to say more. And in fact, the whole second disc is just a series of cutscenes, really, where people are just talking because they wanted to get through the story. I'm glad they did. So, by communicating symbolically, saying, here are 2 people, this is what a relationship looks like, this is what it means to compliment somebody else. Even though these people fight and have differences and are, flawed in themselves, they still round each other off. But also, the idea of the literal embodiment of Sigmund Freud's ideas, right? In XenoGears, there is a person called id, who lives inside the protagonist's head. Again, small spoiler, it doesn't ruin the game for you. It's pretty obvious. But he also has a literal personification of his ego and superego living in his head. So you get to see what it would be like for id, superego, and ego to exist literally. And you get to see that exactly what that would mean in life. And so it gives a really interesting lens onto Freud's work, where we can see that Freud's work probably doesn't hold up, which is an important thing to note, but still is based on interesting concepts. Like the people that we see Faye be are things that we have felt, right? We feel the rage and desires of id. He feels nothing but those rage and desire. He feels nothing but, the violence and envy and rage. And we have felt all those things, but he's the literal embodiment of it. And so it's cathartic, right? I mean, the high drama of a story is cathartic for the low drama of human life. I mean, hopefully most people are living in a low drama situation relative, no, we're not resurrecting and or killing God, and humanity is not turning into 90% of gray goo. So that's good. So that high drama is just a metaphor for the low drama that we feel. So we feel all the same things at a lesser degree, and that's what's cathartic about it. But also there's all the introduction of, ideas like Gnosticism, where the spiritual universe is benevolent and good, and you should seek it, and it requires wisdom and self-knowledge. And the material universe is bad and decays and is full of evil and human suffering and sin. And, you don't have to be a religious person to be like, you know what, that's absolutely correct. These people are jerks. People need to be smarter and read more and listen more and, pay attention and try and transcend all of their don't act on your every impulse, because acting on impulses and desires in the game leads to a lot of bad things. And you get to see those things play out. You get to see how every petty motivation destroys both relationships and countries and an entire populations. We get to see the high drama result of emotions that we all feel all the time. So that was great. But also Gnosticism is just interesting in that it gives you an inroad into the Platonic tradition. So that comes from the philosopher Plato. You actually get to meet, I don't want to ruin, there's certain parts I don't want to ruin, but you get to speak with Platonic entities, I'll call them. And they talk, they give you their perspective, like, if I were a resident of the spiritual world and I had already transcended all things, what would I say to you? And so you actually get to have literal conversation with someone who's at the end of Plato's cave, right? The form itself. And so that gives you a cool inroad into Greek metaphysical thought too, and quantum mechanics at the same time. Although getting into that explanation might be a bit long-winded. And then finally, there's a lot of other not minor thinkers, but great thinkers who are mentioned in minor ways in XenoGears. For example, one of Freud's disciples, not disciples, but one of Freud's later inheritors, Jacques Lacan, is a literal character. There's a character named Lacan in the game. He's literally there. And his name is really meaningful because what Jacques Lacan's work describes and how it modifies Freud is exactly what plays out in Lacan's life. Again, that would be a long discussion, but you can actually see what Lacan's theories mean for the person named Lacan. And what happens to him is a really good example of Lacan's ideas about frustrated desires and negative emotions and things like that and what they become. But also you get to see a lot of Nietzsche, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who believed in the will to power, which literally means that you should take every step you can to change the world around you, shape the world to suit your needs or by your will. It's more complicated than that, but that's a good brief summary. And there's a character in the game who absolutely does that. But he does it in a negative way. He does it in a villainous way. So it looks like if somebody really wanted to practice Nietzsche to the literal and maximal extent that you could, what would that look like? And it looks like an anime villain crossed with Darth Vader. So it gives you a little bit of insight into, maybe don't take Nietzsche too seriously, because the logical end you would get to of this Superman who lives, and the Ubermensch who lives and also is trying to, literally change everything about the world, literally down to the smallest atom. That guy exists and he's kind of a jerk. So it gives you good parameters for understanding Nietzsche and the good that he could do for you in your thought and the interesting things he has to say, but also the problems embedded in his philosophy.
So the game seemed, in that multidisciplinary way, the game seems to give a lot of examples of different people taking on different perspectives, having a core philosophy of their life rather than the way most of us live, which is having a more fluid, take it as it comes, attempting to apply our core values to the things that we interact with in life kind of methodology, and really puts it forward, really makes you see this is the life of this concept. And I think that's really interesting because, especially because it is a game, you feel like a character who will be reacting to people who are taking those actions and living their life in those ways rather than just seeing it play out passively. Just speaking to the core gameplay of XenoGears itself as an RPG, what allows XenoGears as a game to a separate, I guess, because for convenience sake, we'll try to put a separation between the narrative and the ludic elements. What sort of stands out about the ludic elements of XenoGears that attracted you to it?
So, I mean, I got into XenoGears just because PSM, PlayStation Magazine, had given it a 5 out of 5 for a review, and around Thanksgiving, 1998. And I usually liked the games that they recommended, and this was in the golden age of Squaresoft, where anything they released was going to be great. And that was actually true for about 5-6 years there. It was like, you must buy. And if it gets a good review, you must buy now. So I definitely bought it for that reason. And I was 13 when I played it, so I didn't really understand everything that it had to offer right away. But I think that it could not have been anything other than a game without it changing substantially, because certain ludic elements do really matter. For one thing, the game is super long and grim and has lots of text-only scenes, and so it could not have worked as an animation, right? It's got the style of an anime and a lot of the subject matter too, but it was just not paced properly, especially in the late 90s. The second season would have been completely emaciated and would not have gotten it where it wanted to go. Couldn't have been a movie, way too long. It's about 5 times the length of even long movies in terms of script. Latter-day television shows, something on Netflix. Subject matter doesn't really work for that. People want blood, guts, and TNA. As a book, there already is a book where, Gnosticism and philosophy and cutting-edge science all merge into the hunt for a monstrous, paranormal being. That's Moby Dick. So XenoGears, the book, exists. It's Moby Dick. XenoGears and Moby Dick have a ridiculous amount of things in common. Just one of them has giant robots and the other has whaling ship. But they basically cover a lot of the same ground. The style is very different. XenoGears is much more lighthearted, although there are plenty of lighthearted parts in Moby Dick once you get into it. They're both super, super long relative to their peers, just ridiculously long relative to their peers. But there's the number of parallels between the two are shocking. But XenoGears as a book wouldn't work because giant mecha books just don't work. You need to see a giant mecha. They're too seductive. You need to see one. If you can't describe a giant mecha, you want to see. So, I think XenoGears had to be a video game. But also, they take the video game medium and they do things with it. The game, after the prologue, the game proper begins with you controlling Faye, the main character, in a very tiny room in a rather primitive basement of a building. And the game ends with you exploring city-sized spaceships, and meeting literal God, and all sorts of things like that. Like, you go from the smallest of the small to the biggest of the big in terms of where you go in the game. And having a character move around in those spaces really helps you feel that. So when you start, the camera, as it often is in video games, the camera is is placed in such a way that you are centered on the screen and you fill up a significant part of it because you're the character. Everyone needs to see what your body is doing in order to navigate out of that basement and navigate through the town and up the mountain path to meet your friend the doctor. But as the game goes, it begins to be about bigger and bigger concepts. The camera literally zooms back so that phase sprite is just this tiny dot on the screen in this massive ancient buildings and scientific sort of mausoleums. And the gears, the giant robots, become a more important factor. But eventually, even they are sort of dwarfed by these massive environments. So that sense of changing scale as you go from the humble life of a amnesiac painter to emperors and secret ministries and a man who wants to subvert the destiny of the universe. You go from the literal small to the literal huge as you go from the conceptually small to the conceptually vast. So that whole process, I think, makes you feel it. Which as I just said, the whole game is about the literal embodiment of these concepts. Right? We're gonna meet a Ubermensch. We're gonna meet an id. We're gonna meet a platonic deity. And so if you the way it communicates its meaning is through actually literally feeling those things. So the literal transformation from the small to the big helps you to feel like you've made that journey from small ideas to big ideas.
That's really good to hear, because I don't think I've heard anyone express how an RPG, even at this point a classic RPG like XenoGears, can use simple scale to sort of parallel the ideas that it's trying to push forward and create the gaming journalism term is visceral feeling, an embodied feeling of the sort of progression that the narrative is trying to tell. And I agree that I think that is something that is really unique to games, because when you're watching a movie or other visual medium, scale is something that is always presented relative to the one camera shot and the screen in front of you. And you really are just relying on the sort of camera work to try to sell you on it. Whereas when you're playing that game, when the camera's position change, you can feel your own position relative to it change, which you don't feel when you're watching or being the audience of other medium, because your position to the camera as person sitting on couch never changes. You don't have a frame of reference in the media itself. Are there, I guess I'll just open it up a little bit, because we're coming near to the end of our time. Is there any other aspects of the game that you would like to touch on that you think deserve to be expounded on, for people who haven't seen your other stuff on the game itself, and something that really deserves to be highlighted that maybe falls out of the bounds of the two questions?
Yeah, there are other aspects to XenoGears that I think are really important to understanding is why it had to be a game. For one thing, like all RPGs, you can explore the world and talk to people who are not mandatory. And there are a few places where that is really meaningful. When you enter the Sacred Empire of Solaris, they're essentially the antagonist faction, but you are undercover in their town. And you get to meet the enemy, and you find out that not all of them are monsters, and that many of them are sort of on your side and feel bad about what's going on in the world, or feel disaffected from their own society, or see how they exploit the people that are in their society. Or even you get to go explore the laboratory of this sort of mad scientist who is incredibly compellingly drawn. He's probably the most sympathetic character in the whole game, which is quite an achievement for a mad scientist who does human experimentation. But being able to explore his lab and the game never has to sit down and tell you that he's a bad guy, that he did bad things. You get to see it. You get to walk into the holding pens and see the results of human experimentation, and it shakes you. It tells a story in a way that I don't think a book could either. I don't think a book or a television series. I mean, I think of like the episode in Band of Brothers where they uncover the small concentration camps in Germany, and how they see for essentially one episode what that is like and what that means and how people reacted. And it lasts roughly an hour, and not a lot of the time is spent there. Whereas in Krelian's lab, you can be there for several hours, and you're in this whole complex that he basically runs for several hours, and it's very grisly for a long time. And you see, really feel how the whole machinery of this country operates on this underbelly of just totally sadistic, and not sadistic, but totally ruthless and amoral experimentation and horrific things that if people knew about, they'd be disgusted. And so you really get to live that for a while in a way that I don't think any other medium could accomplish. And then there are other things like, I think this is true of many story-based games, especially RPGs, that like the most meaningful bosses are the hardest. And I think RPGs should do that. I think that the hardest bosses should generally be the ones who are built up in the story to be hard. Most games are inconsistent about that. And I understand now that I'm designing RPG bosses for a living. I understand why that is. Small decisions can have big consequences. You don't always have time to correct those fights, when you need to ship the game. But generally, the XenoGears does a really good job of making meaningful boss fights the hardest. And that really raises the stakes of the drama as you're like sweating through your shirt trying to beat some boss. You're like, I don't want to die and have to see all this again. But you get the more of a sense of catharsis for beating that enemy because you literally had to take part in that conflict.
Well, that's great, and I completely agree. Nothing feels more like being cheated when you feel like you've had a difficult journey, only for it to just end without, your effort really playing a role. So I guess we're coming to the end, officially the end here. So I want to thank you again for coming and talking to me on my channel, Pat. I'm going to include a link in the description below to where you can take a look at the Reverse Design series of books and see which one most catches your fancy. And for your YouTube channel, because this is a interview series for people on YouTube, do you have a particular video on your channel that you would like to suggest people go and take a look at?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the greatest YouTuber. I'm very informational. I'm a writer and a scholar of games. So, but if you're interested in the history of game design, like how we got from Space Invaders to Destiny 2, that's a video of mine called "The Evolution of Video Game Design: History and Evolution of Video Game Design" on my channel. You won't find content like that anywhere. It's a bit dry. I'm going to warn you, but you will not find its like elsewhere.
I completely agree with that. And my personal suggestion over on Pat's channel is going to be the video about cadences, because I think if you want to ever talk about pacing in games, that video on just the very basic numerical understanding of how a cadence in a game works is going to be the first place you need to start. Otherwise, you don't have any idea what you're talking about. So I'll thank you again, Pat, and thank you to all of my viewers who came out and decided to watch all the way to the end, because once again, we've done a pretty long interview. I think we just passed the 40-minute mark. So it's
I don't do short. Nothing to do with short. But thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
It was so great having you. And to everyone at home, as always, thank you for watching and stay true.